There has always been something about Lana Del Rey that catches my attention, and that is when people talk about her, they rarely do so with her music in mind. Instead, they remember her for things like Hollywood, vintage styles, American flags, or as someone who writes sad songs. But the more I listen to her music, the more I feel that these levels are missing something. That is, they may explain Lana's image, but not the reason why so many people like me have kept coming back to her music for years. I truly believe that something is closely tied to the way she has changed throughout her career. You can see how most artists reinvent themselves because time forces them to do so. And although Lana Del Rey has transformed, but her evolution has never felt like a desperate attempt to stay relevant. On the contrary, its new album feels like another chapter in the same story, in which she revisits familiar aspects of herself, but at different stage of her life. And perhaps that's the best way I can describe what I mean by that. With her, it's not about making complicated music or writing lyrics that only a few people understand. Right? Depth emerges when a song can accompany you throughout different moments in your life. That's why I'm interested in understanding how an artist can spend more than a decade transforming her music without losing the identity that made her unique from the start. She presented herself surrounded by reference to old Hollywood beauty queens and stories that strengthened the line between fantasy and reality. As a result, for many listeners, that image became so powerful that it almost overshadowed the music itself. It's easy to see why that happened. For example, Born to Die not only showcased new music, but every detail was intentional. The videos, the orchestral production, and her silence, all of which created an atmosphere that felt more cinematic than commercial. Some people admire her originality, while others wondered if she was truly authentic or just playing a role, which is why the criticism focuses on the character rather than her music. These were valid criticisms, but what interests me was how she was able to bring that character to life. I don't think it was a marketing ploy. If it had been, her image would have faded away years later. On the contrary, her person endured because it allowed the Ray to explore emotions that rarely appear in mainstream pop with the same passion and ambiguity. And it is precisely that complexity that is one of the reasons I have never believed that idea that Lana Del Rey write only sad songs. People usually think that when one album ends and another begins, the artist deliberately leave everything that came before behind. But looking at Lana, her transformation never followed that pattern. If anything, it just feels slower, but that's all. The thing is, instead of replacing it, she seems to revisit the same emotional landscape over and over again. That's why I have always loved ultraviolence. It doesn't stray far from Born to Die. In other words, the atmosphere remains melancholic, California is still present, and love is still complicated. However, on ultraviolence, the glamorous world she previously described completely crumbles. The orchestral grandeur that defined much of Born to Die quickly give way to guitars. And instead of sounding distant or theatrical, it feels more intimate. It would be easy to reduce this singer to a gradual artistic evolution, but it is not exactly her case. So we have to ask ourselves why her music, despite her change, continued to feel so connected and at the same time capturing people's attention. In my view, the answer becomes clear when we stop viewing her albums in isolation and begin to see as a part of a whole. And so the recurring themes are no longer repetitive. Memory, love, freedom, fame, disappointment, return time and again, not because she has run out of ideas, but because she refused to let go of questions she still cannot answer for herself. In this way, each album approaches these concepts from a different emotional angle in search of an answer. Maybe that's why some songs have changed along with me without changing at all. For example, All Money didn't mean the same thing to me before I experienced that loss, or Get Free didn't feel like a song about personal freedom until I found myself questioning the direction of my own life. So while Born to Die present a character and ultraviolence began to reveal the person behind it, Norman Fucking Rockwell is that moment when she no longer needed to prove she was different from the other artists. Instead, she sounded comfortable writing for whatever she was in her life at that moment. We find that the songs are more longer, the production is more subject, and the lyrics often feel more like conversations than drama lyrics, monologues. Instead of creating another cinematic world, Lana begins to observe the one around her with greater clarity. This information also explains why her subsequent albums, such as Cantus Over the Country Club and Blue Bannisters, feel like natural continuations rather than unexpected reinventions. These days, new works seem slower and less immediate than the previous ones, and listening to them, I have came to appreciate that they all share something in common. They no longer demand attention, instead they reward passion. When an artist remains active for more than a decade, she faces the challenge: how much should I change so as not to get lost in time? But that was never Lana's real challenge. Rather, it was designed to what extent she was willing to be honest. Let's just say that this honesty is sometimes hard to appreciate since as time goes on. Her music becomes more reflective, featuring love compositions and lyrics that seem like fragments of conversation with herself. And while some may find this monotonous, others see it as artist mature. And there are moments when her most recent music seems reluctant to reveal itself, demanding time with the listener in order to make sense. Once again, criticisms arise as Lana seems more interested in preserving spontaneous or fast thoughts than in crafting perfectly structured albums. I can say with certainty that the most important thing about Lana was never her aesthetic, since aesthetics became trends, ones that eventually fade away. And what remains is something that's very hard to shake off. For example, Lana, having matured without pretending to stay young, possesses a compositional style willing to revisit the same emotions until they reveal something like an answer. Perhaps that's why I keep coming back to Lana Del Rey after all these years. Not because every album is perfect, not because every song speaks to me in the same way. I return because each chapter seems to understand something that the previous one couldn't. In the end, perhaps Lana Del Rey's greatest achievement isn't that she's transformed her music without losing her identity. It's that at some point along the journey, she created music capable of transforming people who are willing to grow alongside her.